Chapter 1. Something crossed the road. It happens fast, usually too quickly for certainty. A driver moving along a narrow country road at dusk when something dark steps out from the hedge, crosses the beam of the headlights, disappears into the trees. It is low to the ground, larger than a dog, with heavy shoulders and a tail almost as long as its body. The witness has only seconds to see it, but in those few seconds one thought becomes fixed: that was a cat, and it was far too large to be there. Reports like this have come from nearly every part of Britain. They arrive from the wooded valleys of Wales, the moors of Devon and Cornwall, the fields of East Anglia, the hills of Yorkshire, and the Scottish Highlands. Sometimes the animal is described as black, sleek, like a leopard seen in silhouette. In other cases it is sandy brown, tawny, or grey like a puma or the short tail and pointed ears of a lynx. The details vary, but certain descriptions appear again and again. Witnesses speak of an animal that moves with a fluid, feline gait, shoulders rising and falling as it walks. They describe a long tail hanging in a curve, rounded ears, a broad head, and a body that seems to glide rather than trot. Many insist they have seen dogs, foxes, deer, and domestic cats all their lives, and that this was none of them. These creatures are usually called British big cats, alien big cats, or phantom cats. The word alien does not mean they come from another planet. It means they are animals living outside their recognized native range, creatures that should not exist in the British countryside but are repeatedly reported there. The most common identities suggested are leopards, pumas, and lynx, though witnesses have also claimed to see servals, jungle cats, and animals they cannot identify at all. One name causes particular confusion. A black panther is not a separate species of cat, but a popular term usually used for a melanistic leopard or jaguar. Melanism is a genetic condition that produces unusually dark fur, although the animal's spots may still be visible in bright light. Leopards can be black, but pumas cannot, which means that a witness reporting a black puma is either mistaken about the color, mistaken about the species, or looking at something else entirely. Britain does have a native wild feline, although its status is precarious. The Scottish wildcat resembles a large, powerfully built tabby and once lived across much more of the country. Today, surviving wild living cats in Scotland have been so heavily affected by breeding with domestic cats that even defining a pure wildcat has become difficult. Impressive as these animals can be, they are still a long way from the black, leopard-sized creatures described in many roadside encounters. The mystery is not based on a handful of stories. Police forces, newspapers, farmers, naturalists, and private investigators have collected thousands of reports over the last several decades. During periods of intense publicity, a single region may produce dozens of sightings within weeks. Witnesses include motorists, hikers, gamekeepers, soldiers, police officers, and people accustomed to judging the size and movement of animals. Quantity, however, is not the same as proof. 1,000 uncertain sightings do not automatically become one certain animal. People can mistake distance, scale, color, and movement, especially in poor light or during an encounter that lasts only seconds. Once the idea of a local big cat becomes widely known, an ordinary animal glimpsed at the edge of vision may be interpreted through a story the witness has already heard. There is also the problem of evidence. Britain is densely populated, heavily farmed, crossed by roads, and covered by security cameras, mobile phones, wildlife cameras, and people walking dogs. A population of large predators should leave more than stories. It should leave clear tracks, droppings, feeding sites, road casualties, bodies, dens, and repeated images that can be examined without relying on memory. Yet the absence of decisive evidence has not ended the reports. Every year brings new photographs, recordings, livestock deaths, and encounters. Most can be disputed, but a few are difficult to explain with evidence convincing enough to keep the mystery alive but never clear enough to settle it. Perhaps hundreds of witnesses have misjudged ordinary animals. Perhaps escaped exotic cats have wandered the countryside one at a time, each surviving long enough to inspire a new wave of stories. Or perhaps something has established itself in the hidden strips of woodland, abandoned quarries, river valleys, and hedgerows. The first question is not whether every witness is telling the truth. Most probably are, at least as they understand it. The real question is whether they are all seeing the same kind of animal, or whether the British big cat is a single name given to many different things moving through the darkness. Chapter 2: The beasts acquire names. A strange animal becomes more powerful once it has a name. A dark shape crossing a field may be forgotten, but the Beast of Exmoor or the Surrey Puma becomes part of the landscape, gathering new sightings even when witnesses describe different sizes, colors, and species. One of the earliest modern cases was the Surrey Puma. During the 1960s, reports spread around Godalming and the surrounding countryside of a large tawny cat moving through fields, woods, and quiet roads. Police, journalists, naturalists, and amateur hunters searched the area, examined tracks, and investigated possible kills, but no animal was captured. The case established a pattern that would be repeated across Britain. A few reports attracted press attention, publicity produced more witnesses, and possibly unrelated encounters were combined into the story of one elusive creature. Once a district expected a puma, almost any unfamiliar animal could become part of the case. During the early 1980s, attention moved to Exmoor. Farmers reported sheep killed or severely injured, while witnesses described a large dark cat crossing the open moor. Newspapers named it the Beast of Exmoor and variously identified it as a puma, leopard, or unknown hybrid. Stories circulated that military marksmen had been sent to hunt the animal. Whether or not every detail was accurate, the idea of armed soldiers stalking an unseen predator transformed the case into a national legend. Exmoor's valleys, wooded slopes, isolated farms, and open ridges provided the perfect setting for something that always vanished before it could be confirmed. The Beast of Bodmin Moor followed much the same course. Persistent reports of black cats, livestock attacks, and strange cries eventually led to a government investigation in the 1990s. Investigators found no reliable evidence of a resident big cat, but the conclusion did little to reduce public interest. A leopard skull discovered near the moor appeared briefly to provide the proof everyone had been waiting for. Examination suggested that it had not been exposed to the British weather for long, and it was probably connected to an imported leopard skin or rug rather than an animal living wild in Cornwall. Other regions soon acquired creatures of their own. East Anglia had the fen tiger, northern England had the Durham puma, and Cumbria produced repeated reports of a black panther. Dartmoor, Wales, the Forest of Dean, Yorkshire, and parts of Scotland all developed their own clusters of encounters. The names created the impression that each region contained one identifiable predator. In reality, reports associated with a single beast might be separated by decades and many miles. Some witnesses described a black leopard-like animal, others a sandy puma, and others a short-tailed lynx. These contradictions rarely weakened the legend. Instead, they encouraged theories that several species were living in Britain or that generations of cats had been born in the wild. The failure to capture one could even be presented as evidence of its intelligence and skill at avoiding humans. Newspapers benefited from memorable names, while communities adopted the creatures as part of local folklore. The beasts became subjects of television reports, pub conversations, guided walks, and stories repeated to visitors. Once the name was established, an uncertain sighting near Bodmin was no longer simply a large black animal, it became another appearance by the Beast of Bodmin. This does not mean the witnesses were lying. Most probably encountered something they genuinely could not identify. The problem began when a domestic cat seen at the wrong distance, a loose dog in long grass, and a real escaped exotic animal were all placed into the same file. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had developed an entire hidden geography of panthers, pumas, and lynx. The names made the creatures seem permanent even when the evidence remained fleeting. Yet exotic cats really have escaped, been released, and survived in Britain, and in several cases the animal behind the legend was entirely real. Chapter 3: The Cats That Really Were There. The strongest argument for British big cats begins with an undisputed fact: exotic cats have escaped or been released into the countryside. Some were captured, some were killed, and others survived long enough to enter local legend. The question is whether these isolated animals ever formed a permanent wild population. For much of the 20th century, private ownership of dangerous animals was surprisingly easy. Collectors, entertainers, circuses, small zoos, and ordinary enthusiasts could acquire lions, pumas, leopards, lynx, and other exotic species with little oversight. Security standards varied, and many owners were unprepared for the cost of keeping a powerful predator. That changed with the Dangerous Wild Animals Act of 1976. The law required owners to obtain licenses, maintain secure enclosures, and prove that their animals were safely kept. A popular theory claims that some responded by releasing unwanted animals rather than surrendering them or improving their facilities. The theory is plausible, but it is often repeated as though hundreds of cats were released in one event. No evidence supports a coordinated mass release. What probably happened was smaller, messier, and spread across many years. One of the best-known confirmed cases involved a female puma named Felicity. She was captured near Cannock in the Scottish Highlands in 1980 after a series of sightings. She appeared well-fed and unusually comfortable around people, suggesting that she had escaped or been released from captivity. Felicity spent the rest of her life at Highland Wildlife Park. Her capture proved that a puma had lived loose in Scotland, but also revealed the limits of such evidence. One animal could explain a temporary cluster of reports without proving that others were breeding nearby. An even stranger case emerged from a museum specimen. Researchers examined the remains of a Canada lynx shot in Devon early in the 20th century. The animal had apparently survived in the wild for some time, showing that exotic cats were roaming Britain long before the 1976 licensing law. This weakens the claim that the entire phenomenon began when owners released animals after the law changed. Exotic pets had escaped for generations, while traveling shows, private collections, and public menageries all created opportunities for animals to vanish. In 2001, another lynx appeared in a garden in Cricklewood, North London. Initial reports described a leopard, but the animal was identified as a Eurasian lynx. Its presence in a densely populated area showed how easily a real exotic cat could be mistaken for something larger. More recent cases continue the pattern. Servals and other medium-sized wild cats occasionally escape from private collections, while unauthorized lynx releases have occurred in Scotland. Such incidents are usually discovered when the animals approach homes, attack livestock, appear on cameras, or are captured. A released cat does not need to survive for decades to create a mystery. A puma roaming a rural district for one winter could generate dozens of sightings before dying unseen or moving elsewhere. Years later, another animal might produce a new wave of reports in the same region. This helps explain why British big cat stories appear continuous when the animals may not be. Separate escapees, released pets, and misidentified native species become connected through memory and newspaper archives. The legend survives after each individual case has ended. The problem becomes greater when the claim shifts from occasional escapees to a breeding population. An animal released in the 1970s could not account for sightings today. Half a century of reports would require repeated releases, successful reproduction, or both. Breeding would require animals of the same species and opposite sex to occupy overlapping territories. Their young would need to survive, disperse, find mates, and continue the cycle without leaving clear dens, carcasses, repeated tracks, or convincing genetic evidence. That is possible in theory, but far harder to hide than one solitary animal. Confirmed escapees keep the mystery alive because they prove witnesses are not always mistaken. Sometimes there really is a puma in the forest or a lynx behind a garden fence. What they do not prove is that Britain supports a hidden, self-sustaining population. The distinction between those claims is central to the mystery. Britain has unquestionably had big cats at large, but evidence for generations living and breeding beyond captivity remains elusive. Chapter 4: Tracks, Claws, and Mistaken Cats. If large cats live in Britain, they should leave physical evidence. Investigators have collected paw prints, hair, droppings, scratched trees, damaged livestock, and photographs of feline shapes in distant fields. Almost every item seems persuasive at first, yet most become uncertain under examination. Tracks are among the most common discoveries. Cat prints tend to be round, with 4 toes and no visible claw marks because cats retract their claws while walking. Dog prints are usually more oval, and their claws often register in mud or snow. The distinction is less reliable than it sounds. Soft ground can distort a dog print into a rounded shape, while damaged toes or an unusual stride may hide the claws. A domestic cat crossing wet soil can leave a print that expands as the edges collapse, making the animal seem larger. Plaster casts preserve the shape but rarely the circumstances. Investigators may not know how long the print was exposed, whether several tracks overlap, or whether rain enlarged it. Without a trail showing stride and repeated impressions, one dramatic footprint proves little. Scratches on trees present similar problems. Large cats mark territory by clawing trunks, leaving parallel cuts that may suggest a powerful animal. Yet deer, dogs, machinery, falling branches, and people can produce similar marks once the context is lost. Livestock deaths seem more substantial because they involve a carcass. Farmers have reported sheep with puncture wounds, torn throats, missing flesh, or injuries unlike ordinary dog attacks. Some bodies appear dragged or partly concealed, behavior associated with large cats. A carcass does not always reveal what killed it. An animal may die from illness, exposure, or a dog attack before foxes, birds, and other scavengers alter the remains. By the time investigators arrive, later damage may obscure the original wounds. Predators also behave differently depending on hunger, disturbance, and opportunity. Dogs may bite repeatedly and leave several animals injured, while cats usually kill efficiently before feeding. These patterns are useful, but not strict rules. Photographs should settle the matter, especially now that almost everyone carries a camera. Instead, they have produced some of the most disputed evidence. A dark feline shape may look enormous in an empty field, then resemble a domestic cat once the location is revisited. Scale is the central problem. The eye estimates size partly through distance. When a cat stands on a ridge or crosses open ground without a fence, person, or vehicle beside it, the viewer may assume it is farther away and therefore much larger. Zoom lenses worsen the effect by flattening apparent distance. A domestic cat near the camera may seem to stand beside a hedge far behind it. Blurred edges remove the anatomical details that might reveal its identity. Some famous images have been recreated at their original locations. Investigators place a person, model cat, or measuring pole where the animal appeared and discover that the supposed panther was smaller than witnesses believed. Other photographs remain unresolved because its precise position cannot be recovered. Movement may be more convincing than a still image. Witnesses describe shoulders rolling beneath the skin, a body held low, and a long tail trailing behind it. These details may identify the animal as feline without proving it was larger than an ordinary cat. Britain contains domestic cats that are unusually large, heavily built, or long-haired. Feral cats may appear leaner and more muscular than pets, while unfamiliar breeds create striking silhouettes. In Scotland, hybridization between domestic cats and Scottish wildcats has produced varied sizes, markings, and behavior. The Kellis cat shows how folklore can contain a genuine biological puzzle. Large black cats reported in northeastern Scotland were once dismissed as legends. Specimens later showed that some were dark hybrids of domestic cats and Scottish wildcats, unusual animals but not hidden leopards. Mistaken identity cannot explain every report with certainty. Some witnesses see animals at close range beside roads, fences, sheep, or vehicles. Farmers, police officers, hunters, and animal keepers have described cats they believed were far beyond domestic size. Experience may improve judgment, but it does not preserve the encounter for scientific examination. Once the animal disappears, even a detailed account remains testimony rather than a specimen. Honest observers can still misjudge an unexpected event lasting seconds. For decades, the mystery remained trapped between sightings and ambiguous traces. Every print could belong to a dog, every carcass could have been altered, and every photograph could be challenged. Then investigators began finding something harder to dismiss: the genetic signature of a large cat. Chapter 5: The DNA in the countryside. For decades, every piece of British big cat evidence depended on what someone saw or how an investigator interpreted a track, wound, or photograph. DNA promised something different. A strand of hair, saliva left in a bite wound, or tissue caught on a fence might identify an animal that had already disappeared. Professor Robin Allaby and his team at the University of Warwick developed an ecological forensics service to test suspected predator evidence. The laboratory examines samples for feline DNA while also checking for dogs and foxes, allowing an ordinary scavenger to be identified alongside any unusual result. The work began after the team examined a young roe deer found on National Trust land in 2012. The wounds appeared consistent with a large cat attack, but testing found fox DNA instead. The case demonstrated the value of genetic evidence and the danger of identifying a predator from injuries alone. Useful samples can include hair caught on gates, droppings, or sterile swabs taken from bite wounds. Collection must happen quickly and carefully because rain, sunlight, decay, scavengers, and human handling can damage or contaminate the material. DNA is powerful only when investigators can explain where it came from and how it was preserved. In 2022, black hairs recovered from barbed wire in Gloucestershire were reported as closely matching leopard DNA. The claim attracted attention, but the laboratory remained anonymous, making its methods and the chain of custody difficult for outsiders to assess. A more important result emerged from Cumbria the following year. A woman discovered a recently dead sheep and reported disturbing a large black animal that fled from the carcass. She later returned with a swab kit and collected material sent to Allaby's laboratory at Warwick. Testing reportedly detected DNA belonging to the genus Panthera. That group includes lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, and snow leopards, so the result did not identify one species. A leopard or jaguar was suggested because both can occur in a black, or melanistic, form, although a leopard better fits British reports. The finding matters because it came from a carcass rather than a distant image. Allaby said the sequence was genuinely Panthera and that the small amount recovered did not resemble an obvious attempt to plant abundant exotic DNA. Even so, one sample cannot reveal when the animal arrived, how long it survived, or whether others exist. The same swabs also contained fox DNA. That does not cancel the Panthera result, but it shows how quickly several species may contact one carcass. A predator may kill an animal, a fox may scavenge it, and investigators may later collect traces from both. Contamination remains a concern in every unusual DNA case. Material might be transferred through clothing, equipment, animal products, captive collections, or poor laboratory controls. Deliberate planting is also possible, although obtaining and placing convincing biological material would require more effort than a casual hoax. There is another limitation. A short genetic sequence can identify a broad group without producing the complete genome needed to compare individual animals. It cannot show whether samples from Cornwall, Cumbria, or Gloucestershire came from related cats, separate escapees, or entirely different events. To prove a hidden population, investigators would need several independently collected samples from different places and times. Those samples would require strong chains of custody, repeated laboratory confirmation, and enough information to identify species, sex, relationships, and population structure. Evidence of reproduction would be especially important. DNA from adults, cubs, dens, and repeated kills within connected territories could reveal animals living as a population rather than appearing as isolated escapees. One leopard leaving saliva on one sheep would be remarkable, but it would not establish generations of leopards. The Cumbrian result therefore occupies an uncomfortable position. It is stronger than a blurred photograph and more specific than a witness description, yet it remains a single reported detection rather than a complete zoological case. Believers see the first scientific crack in decades of skepticism, while critics see an intriguing result requiring replication. DNA has not ended the British big cat mystery. It has changed the standard of evidence and shown how the question might finally be answered. The breakthrough will not be another dramatic story, but several carefully collected samples pointing to the same animals, in the same landscape, over time. Chapter 6: What is living out there? The evidence leaves several explanations, and the truth may involve more than one. Most sightings could be ordinary animals seen under poor conditions, while a smaller number may involve exotic cats that escaped or were released. Misidentification remains the simplest answer. Domestic cats can appear enormous when distance is misjudged, especially on hillsides or through zoom lenses. Dogs, foxes, deer, and shadows moving through vegetation can also create brief shapes that witnesses interpret as feline. Publicity increases the effect. Once newspapers report a panther in a district, people begin watching every dark shape more closely. Reports multiply even when the number of unusual animals has not changed. This does not mean witnesses are dishonest. A person may accurately remember seeing something strange while being mistaken about its size or identity. The mind fills gaps quickly when an animal crosses a road at night and vanishes within seconds. Occasional escapees provide a second explanation. Britain has produced confirmed pumas, lynx, servals, and other exotic cats outside captivity. One loose animal could generate reports across a wide area before being captured, dying unseen, or moving elsewhere. This would explain why sightings sometimes arrive in intense local waves and then stop. It also accounts for experienced witnesses describing unmistakably feline movement at close range. In some cases, they may have seen exactly what they believed they saw. Repeated escapes could create the illusion of a continuous population. A puma in one decade might be followed years later by a leopard or lynx in the same region. Local memory and newspaper archives would connect animals that had no relationship to one another. The most dramatic possibility is successful breeding. Britain provides deer, rabbits, woodland, river valleys, quarries, and hedgerows, while leopards and pumas can adapt to living near human settlements. A solitary cat might survive for years without being clearly recorded. A population would be harder to conceal. Breeding requires several animals of the same species, overlapping territories, and young that survive to adulthood. Each generation would create more tracks, kills, droppings, carcasses, and opportunities for cameras to capture them. Large cats would also die from disease, injury, starvation, conflict, or traffic. Britain contains millions of drivers, walkers, farmers, and wildlife cameras, yet no unquestionable leopard or puma carcass has emerged from the countryside. Believers point out that large cats are solitary, nocturnal, and skilled at avoiding people. Leopards can hide in surprisingly small areas and drag prey into heavy cover. That may explain one elusive animal, but it becomes less convincing when applied to a breeding population spread across decades. There is another explanation that belongs as much to folklore as zoology. The British big cat now shares the countryside with phantom black dogs, lake monsters, strange lights, and creatures encountered on lonely roads. It has become a modern legend that remains just plausible enough to survive. Unlike a ghost, the animal is biologically possible. Every confirmed escape strengthens the story, while every unclear photograph keeps it from being settled. The mystery endures because the central claim is improbable without being impossible. The evidence needed to resolve it is clear. Investigators would require a carcass recovered under controlled conditions, repeated DNA results from several locations, or clear camera images with reliable scale. Cubs, a den, or genetic relationships between several animals would demonstrate reproduction rather than a solitary escape. Until that happens, the most reasonable conclusion is divided. Large exotic cats have unquestionably lived loose in Britain, and some modern witnesses may have encountered them. What remains unproven is the existence of a hidden, self-sustaining population. Return to the road at dusk. Something dark enters the headlights, moves with the unmistakable grace of a cat, and disappears before the driver reaches for a phone. The witness knows what they saw, while science knows what has not yet been demonstrated. If leopards truly live in one of the most watched and populated landscapes on Earth, their greatest mystery is not how they arrived. It is how they have remained almost visible for so long. Next time on strAInge, we leave the British countryside and travel east to confront restless corpses that move through the night with their arms extended. The next episode is all about hopping vampires.